On this special preview episode of Pop the Left, Doug and I discuss why we decided to resurrect this program. This is the new Pop the Left podcast, which is, I think it's good to bring it back. It's, nostalgic for me now. It's kind of hard to believe.
Yeah, given A, how it ended, and B, even though it was a 2-year project or a year-and-a-half project, we actually didn't record that many of them, maybe 11.
No, but I always thought, and I was misunderstanding or just projecting, but I always thought that they were rather popular. That even like if I really had my way, what I would have done from the very start was Pop the Left, and not Diet Soap. That Pop the Left had a clearer focus, and it was about something substantial, whereas Diet Soap was sort of all over the place. Same with Zero Squared, I think. But the difficulty was I was working with this asshole on Pop the Left.
Yeah. Who, would send long strings of expletives over your like understanding of Hegel.
Yeah, right. We were clearly having there was something else going on there.
Yeah.
But no, we're going to try it again, and I think it's both an opportune time and it's also a very difficult time to try to critique the left.
It feels harder now. Partly because my own critiques have gotten smarter and more rooted in things. And a lot of the stuff that used to bug me just doesn't feel as important anymore. The Vampire Castle or whatever just is not, it's not really the primary problem. And in fact, a lot of times I think it's a distraction from other things. I mean, you and I have both privately messaged each other, we actually are beginning to sort of miss the old anarchist days.
That's
pure
true,
nostalgia, but still.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I miss the days in which, I miss 99 because I was 20 years younger, but also because there was a sense that even if it wasn't fully understood or worked out, that the goal was to overcome capitalism, or at least corporatism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And today, it's very unclear what the left's actual positive project is. And it's also, I think we're still sort of working in a terror management role, capacity right now.
Yeah, I think so too.
After Trump.
You know what the funny thing about that, though, is we really should have been in a terror management capacity after Obama.
Yeah. Well, or, we should have been, I guess we were in the Bush years as well, working with terror management, maybe more profoundly than now.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And that Obama was kind of perceived to be a reprieve. We had gotten off the hook. We weren't going to become the totalitarian nightmare world that the Bush administration seemed to promise.
But what's funny about all that is that's all forgotten now. I mean, and the other thing is Obama was a reprieve in scope and in severity and in style, but not really in kind. And it's easy to forget that, although criticizing Obama seems to be increasingly more on the table, it's also increasingly not as interesting because it's sort of transparently obvious. Like, Obama was a status quo president when we needed something different, but whatever.
Yeah. Well, for me, the key to understanding Obama, and I was critical of Obama the entire time, was that he didn't roll back the surveillance state and try to restore protections of civil liberties after the institution of the Patriot Act and the creation of total information awareness. So that was that he took the wrong stance on those issues very early on in his administration. And then he didn't make it easier for unions either. There was going to be, I don't even remember the details, but there was going to be something about getting rid of the card check rule or making it easier to organize unions.
Yeah, it wasn't like Bernie Sanders, the recent Bernie Sanders style, which probably it even of itself wouldn't have been enough. But it was going to make it easier to get unions, and there were some other things about it, like political unionizing would have still been illegal under Taft-Hartley, but it was going to be like the first union reprieve in a long time. That obviously didn't happen.
Right, and he promised that he would support it during the campaign, and then immediately did not. So those are a couple of for me. Those are like the canaries in the coal mine that I could see where his administration was going. And then the question of the banks and the economy and how to respond to the economic crisis was the question I couldn't immediately answer. I didn't have a knee-jerk response to it. I mean, I did, but it wasn't satisfactory, and that's why I started podcasting. Really, it was a couple of other reasons too, but that was one of the major goals of podcasting, was to understand the economic crisis and what a solution to it might be, or what we should do to protect our own interests in that time and that kind of thing. And I don't think any president would have acted much differently, even someone like Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
In that moment.
Well, there's a bunch of, you and I are talking like normal pundits right now, and
we are.
And I think there's going to be some whiplash in this episode for regular listeners, because they're going to hear things that sound like normal punditry, and they hear things that they would expect us to say. And I think they're going to hear things that people have forgotten we once believed, and because we've been quieter about it. The one thing that Obama did, and I've been thinking about this for a while in the final episodes of Symptomatic Redness when they come out, which will probably be after this, weirdly. But I mused about how weirdly there's this intersection of political and economic determinism that I don't know how else to put it other than Bonapartism, but you can put whatever ism you want to, executivism, imperial presidency, whatever you think.
Mm-hmm.
But depending on where the economy is, and you access that out, and then you look at where the left is moving at any given particular moment of time, it seems to be driven by the media mood around the presidency, but that's driven kind of by economics. And so there's an intersection. I got, in my final SR episodes with Amogh, I got really ranty about this, and I sounded pretty down on the left. But not because they're even doing anything wrong, but because of the lack of self-awareness about how, like, these things travel in predictable circles, and kind of have since, I don't know, when you say like the 60s, like it's remarkable how you can kind of predict this since, let's say, the immediate post-war consensus started to fall apart. And the weird thing about the post-war consensus, like in this grand scheme of history, is that it was so fucking brief.
Yeah, it really was.
Like we set our entire normalcy for Western world is literally set for a period that even in Europe only lasted about 15 years, not even a half a like barely over a half a generation.
Think about that for a minute. Yeah, 1945, say to
1960. So like 1960, but then you also have to get like 45 to 52 is rebuilding, so nothing's normalized yet.
No, right. And it's really more like 1954. Let's say let's talk about an arbitrary thing, but the end of rationing in Europe and the UK.
Right.
That was like 1954. Well, by 1969, there was no normalcy anymore.
Right.
15 years later.
I mean, so like as soon as it begun, it had already begun to decay.
Right.
And I mean, similarly. So what I noticed is for a lot of proto-leftists preoccupied, that was the period that there was this boner during the Obama years for like a more inclusive rainbow coalition, but really it was a rainbow coalition around, say, post-New Deal era. And the funny thing about that, when people talk about the New Deal, they're not really talking about the New Deal because, yeah, you have the great man figure of Roosevelt, but the policies they think about are really after World War II.
Right.
Like, they do like the massive works accumulation, but like that's really the only thing about the New Deal that they like. it wasn't even that Keynesian of it was kind of proto-Keynesian, but it wasn't even that Keynesian of an economic policy. I mean, and it also had austerity measures in it at certain time periods. I mean, people just don't really know it that well. And so they have that face, but they're really thinking about, like, you know, the post-war consensus with Keynesianism, but this time for queer people and people of color.
What about Social Security? Didn't that come out of the New Deal?
Yeah. But wasn't really stabilized in the way we know it till probably the 60s either. I mean, didn't really have to pay out much, honestly, until then. But like Medicare and Medicaid and all that, that's all Johnson, you know, Great Society era.
Right.
War on poverty, you know, period stuff that they kind of retroject back in time. So it's really 50s, early 60s. And, you know, the tax rates that they're talking about, that was even under a Republican administration. So, you know, when the marginal tax rate was like 80% or something, it wasn't that high, but it was very, very high. Now, tax rate on margins, not a net tax rate on wealth, and people don't really understand that. But like, still, it was a completely different time period, and we kind of have a conflated view of that when the left talks about this. And the weird thing about the 90s, and look, I think that I don't really believe in generational politics, but one of the things that I have found is, as the cohort that we like to call Gen X ages, it is remarkably conservative in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know that that's entirely like we tend to read that. There's this tendency right now to read all this stuff as generational politics. And I think that's actually kind of wrong-headed. But, you know, you're a Gen Xer and you look around you, and what I think we're seeing is Gen X. The reason why Gen X feels so conservative right now is that it has not had, as a cohort, hasn't had, you know, fiscal security till, I don't know, the end of the Trump administration. I mean, this part of I'd say the end, I'm being optimistic. This current iteration of the Trump administration.
Right. So, okay, this is important to note, because you said something earlier, which is that the economy sort of sets the attitude around a president. But I think that in the cases of Obama and Trump, really that can't be said to be the case, or not clearly, because Obama was relatively popular, certainly amongst on the left, and the economy was not great. I mean, it was really bad at the beginning, and it wasn't blamed on him because the crisis started right before he was elected. But he didn't bring on a very fast and deep recovery. And under Trump, while the recovery, I think, is still brittle and there are lots of signs of problems, and like I have a friend who's moved into our house because he got evicted from a place he'd been living for 30 years. And so that's a sign, I think, of the so-called success of the economy creating problems, right? Because the reason he was evicted was because they sold the house he was in. And the property values are going up and up and up. So people are losing, their rents are unreasonable, and they're losing their homes as well if they're renters. And it's not just him. We know another woman down the street with some kids that we've known for a long time. She's been evicted from the house that she was rented. And again, it's because they're selling in a couple months. But that's still a sign of a rather robust economy. And it may be brittle and it may be a bubble, but it's still happening. And it doesn't seem to be influencing Trump's popularity that much. I mean, it certainly isn't changing the way the left thinks about him.
Right, and Trump's bubble popularity is actually also not in areas that are doing economically well. Right. I mean, yes, it is true. It's not among the poor or even the working class, despite the initial narratives about that. But what you'll find is it's in areas that are more depoliticized, or maybe even feel anti-political, because their economic situation is quite bad. They've been hemorrhaging people to the cities. They have been seeing, like, the urban areas, in these areas are seeing revitalizations because coastal cities are becoming too expensive. Basically, particularly on the north end of the East Coast and on the West Coast all the way into the Mountain West now, you have these bubble economies from California rippling, and also now Washington State rippling up and down. It's really messed up Oregon's situation. But it is actually a sign of a certain kind of booming economy. But it's a very bubbly economy. It is also not driven by real commodities.
Right.
I mean, there's all kinds of problems there. And the fundamental nature of the workforce and like institutions are decaying, and there are beginning to have repercussions that make the old, I say old conservative, paleo-conservative concerns about like the decline of population growth and stuff are going to start to show too. I mean, a lot of systems are based on an ever-expanding population, much less economy, and we don't have an expanding population anymore. And with the fear about immigrants exacerbating that, it's going to get interesting. And that's also not a trend unique to the United States. The United States is so big that leftists tend to like see it as sui generis and ignore the trends everywhere else. I mean, the fact that people still have weird like boners for Europe confuses the shit out of me right now.
Who has a weird boner for Europe?
I mean, liberals still kind of do. It's beginning to fade. I think Brexit was a wake-up call. I think they really haven't understood the situation in France, because some people see Macron as some kind of like left liberal, which is nutty. You know, they see the center holding in Germany and think the center is left wing, even though it's the goddamn Christian Democrats. Right. I mean, like, they don't fundamentally, you know, like Angela Merkel, who like before Obama, when Obama was still president, we used to make fun of for making Palestinian girls cry, is now seen as a savior of the immigration regime. And so those analyses are just fundamentally, they're just kind of false. I mean, like, it's rooted in a kind of an American exceptionalism that when gets overripe inverts on itself. And that's the theme that we used to talk about all the time on Pop the Left, that sort of cultural American particular view, which a lot of people have, is misleading. It's highly misleading.
Right. Yeah, and it comes across, one of the ways it's expressed is as anti-Americanism.
Right.
Right. It's not the only way it's expressed, but you know, let's talk about this tendency to do what we've been doing. We've been talking like pundits this whole time, looking at all these little fragments, right? Mm-hmm. And what I hope to do with Pop the Left is try to understand some of the persistent dynamics that are shaping our politics. They may shape them in very different ways in different moments, but I'm hoping to discover just how it is that our politics are being formed, or how the left is being moved, and why there seems to be a pattern of repetition that's really strong on the left. I mean, you just can see, like, and it seems to be accelerating. Maybe it's just where I pay attention, but it's like, you know, you'll have like right now we're going through a phase where I think Marxist-Leninism is popular again, and sort of a certain kind of statism is taking hold on the left. But at the same time, you know, there's a portion of the left that is returning to like magical thinking and wanting to break with rationality and embrace like, I don't know, that's what acid communism seems to be about, and
witchy communism and all that stuff.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And I'm thinking that maybe a way in is to talk about the attention economy. So my thought with the attention economy is that that it tries to, we use it to explain a lot, at least about how the online left functions. But what we don't have a good understanding of is why certain kinds of things are likely to grab attention. Like, what is the ideology of the clique? And that's something I'd like to figure out, because we are in that space.
Well, part of what drives us, if you get into that terror management mode, one of the things about terror management, people actually read the psychological literature on it, right, is it's not just about managing like the immediate existential threat. It's also about managing your general existential identity, because as long as you have an identity, you can say you're not dead and, you know, project some kind of faux immortality onto that identity, because it also feels larger than you. What we're seeing on cliques and stuff is a politics of differentiation. And I'm going to sound like a normal, almost like a normal banal, like Vox, you know, liberal, secretly conservative person for a second. But I actually think this is rooted in a Marxist conception that we kind of have to deal with. there is very little real community to speak of. Now, real community itself is almost a reification. It's almost fake, right? But when you look at the way we talk about politics right now, most people's politics is removed from even ethics. You know, conservatives can talk about virtue signaling all they fucking want to, but they're also generally like removed from power, right? Like the people who are actually talking about this, they don't have power. Even the pundits largely don't really have power. They're largely taking script. So what you're seeing there is a kind of way to give yourself some kind of identity. It's a way to try to take your own narrative and spin it. And one of the reasons why, like, say, ML might be very popular online, and I will say you do see them in real life, but at a much smaller capacity, is that it differentiates you from social democrats and differentiates you from, like, the status quo and from like Americanism. It's also super popular in red states because you're actually pushing back harder against the culture, against a culture that pushes harder on you. If you're gonna push, you might as well push all the way. So the incentives are quite different. I mean, like, let's be honest. Who pays social capital to be in the DSA? You really, I mean, other than KeyWiki, which doesn't really matter, you really don't. Now, people are going to be mad at me for saying that. In certain areas you do, but like it can help your career in a place like Brooklyn.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Like, it's not even like a dumb apolitical move.
Yeah. Well, okay. But one thing that I will just question is the idea that the being on the left should cost you personally in terms of social capital, or that's some sort of litmus test for the legitimacy of your position. I don't think it is necessarily, but so, like, for instance, the fact that, yeah, in Brooklyn, being a part of the DSA is a way to build a power base personally, but also that means that there's a politics going on, right?
No, it doesn't.
I mean, that means
that's bullshit.
That's fake. Okay,
fake news.
Okay, all right. Let's try it again. Let me try it again. That would be attendant to any real politics going on. If not, it's necessary, or at least it's a good sign that there's a politics going on. If that's not going on, there isn't a politics going on.
Okay, I could agree with you if we were talking about a community, but as for a way to become upwardly mobile, yeah, that's apolitics, but we're not supposed to be about apolitics, Doug.
Okay, fair enough. But I'm just saying, like, you know, upwardly mobile within what is the problem here, right?
Right. I mean, well, the problem is not that anyone's upwardly mobile. I'm not one of those sackcloth and, dirt communists. The problem actually is that the reason why it not costing social capital is kind of a problem is that it implies that you're not actually dangerous, and these people want to be dangerous. And if you got social capital within a movement and even bettered yourself, like within the working class or something, that would be one thing. And, there are people I know who have like almost conspiracy theories about the suppression of militancy in the United States. And it's like to help capitalism, it takes the working class away from their one true effect. And I find this to be diluted, frankly. Like, we're not that important, and we're still not that important. And that's part of the problem. If there's a real politics around this, you should be able to benefit from it. But also there'd be a cost to it. There's a real politics around being a Trumpist, and there's a cost to being a Trumpist. You get both benefits and you lose things. There is an economy of exchange there. What is it for us? What do you lose, really?
Well, there is a way in which if you're on certain levels in a certain class, say, as a media personality, you do lose status for supporting Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
You're unlikely to become a full-time anchor on MSNBC. You're not going to be a major go-to person on CNN. It certainly wouldn't cost you in the academy.
No. And it's not going to even cost you in the interim media anymore. Like you're right. You'll never be a top tier. You won't get to write for the New Yorker editorial pages.
Even if Bernie wins, you'll probably still be blocked from certain elite institutions.
Right. But you're not. But the funny thing, I actually don't know that you're blocked from those institutions. You're blocked from moving up in them. Like the Washington Post hates Bernie Sanders more than the New York Times does. I mean, that's abundantly clear. But they have staffers and low-level writers who are Bernie supporters, and they don't get any flack for it. The flack is like you could never be one of their headliners who gets an opinion column, right? But the other thing is those social forces are already somewhat delegitimated. So, like, I mean, in some ways, the conservative reaction here is actually proof of that. And in this way, the people in Brooklyn and the Bay are really behind the times because, yeah, they're mad that they're shut out of elite institutions, but they don't want to burn those elite institutions down. We used to want to burn those elite institutions down, Doug. Remember that? Like, we used to hate them.
I'm going to say that I know what you're talking about. Although I was always in a position where I was sort of forced to be hypocritical because of someone who wanted to write fiction for a living. I, on the one hand, hated the ideology, say, at, I don't know, Ballantine or some New York publisher, but also wanted their recognition and support.
Yeah. I mean, weirdly, that particular hypocrisy used to be a lot more possible, oddly. But, I mean, you know, I can think of plenty of anarchisty, like, fantasy writers, for example, who got, you just look at Ursula K. Le Guin, you know. And that's not to disparage her good name either. That's not an insult. And, yeah, I get it. Like, I just feel like there's been a certain drive. I feel like the hatred of elites has been linked so much to conservatism. And the problem with the hatred of elites, right, and you and I could talk about this, one is it's not structural enough, really. And two, it's not systemic enough. It tends to personalize things. You know, both Marx and even Bakunin would talk about not personalizing them, that not, you know, you don't judge the morality of the individual capitalist, even though you want to burn down capitalism. You know, like that, I get that, but there is a certain sense that, like, I don't think we want to burn these, like, it's not just that we don't hate the people. I don't think we really want to burn the institutions down anymore. Because the institutions are also part of the resistance. We think we can co-opt them. And so the statism, right, to get back to your attention economy of cliques, in this way, the social democrats and the Marxist-Leninists who seem to be utterly opposed really aren't. And they never have been either. Like, their actual policies derive from each other. There are people on both sides who are secretly the other. Like, right. Like, we're not going to out anybody right now, but we know it. There's a lot of people in the DSA who, like, really get off on those Marxist-Leninist friendly podcasts, like, way more than social democrat friendly ones. Right. And then there are people like me who are linked with more militant positions. I'm not an ML by any stretch of the imagination because I'm not really a statist in that way, but like who also listen to like the things more adjacent to like normacy and power because we kind of want to know what they're thinking.
But I want to get back to the intention economy thing, but let me just talk about what Zero Book's position has been or how we've been shaped by the social democratic turn over the last couple of years since Trump was elected. I mean, there is just no getting around the fact that the election of Trump and the ascendancy of Chapo has had a dramatic impact, has a dramatic effect on the way the left media has been operating and the size of it as well. That when I started podcasting in 2009, during the beginnings of the Obama administration, I was one of very few actual socialist podcasts in existence. And the ones that did exist were either tied to sectarian organizations, some small sectarian Marxist groups that therefore are really erratic and probably short-lived, or they were, hell, I'm having a hard time thinking of them. They were either that or they weren't actually on the left at all, really. They were somebody who was a libertarian but thought of himself as being on the left. Mm-hmm. Those were the things that come to mind anyway. And then over time, some people came on, some of them, like the Alpha to Omega podcast, influenced by diet soap. But that's not what brought on I can't claim any responsibility for the big podcast, the left podcast scene. That all came out of Chapo. That all came out of the election of Trump and the Chapo moment, which is a social democratic turn, represents a social democratic turn, as did the massive expansion of the DSA.
Right.
In the face of Trump and the failure, success of the Bernie Sanders campaign, everyone decided if we'd only really pushed for Sanders, if only Sanders had really had his moment, we would have avoided this nightmare. Let's get behind that now. Let's try again in that direction. But over the years, that has sort of crumbled apart.
Yeah, it has diminishing returns. I mean, one, Chapo is no longer as fresh-voiced. It's also has its own internal contradictions, and I don't actually even say this as a critique of the Chapo people. Like, they have been aware. I got from reading their book is snarky and kind of like, you know, a comedy book that it was. That you would read their book and you would read like some ultra left positions, some quasi Stalinist positions, some New Deal positions. And, you know, like they strongly critique the New Deal in the past, for example. Right. But they don't now. And their reasons for that are largely not even cynical opportunism.
No.
You know, it's actually, they're completely open about it. And like, and in a way, I even found it refreshing when I realized how open they were about it. But what I feel like we forget, because we're in opposition right now, is you don't have to deal with the corruption of wielding a system and not dismantling it. There has been a tendency, I mean, George Orwell of all people, and I don't think George Orwell is one of the paradigms of people we should turn to, but of all people pointed out the paradox of this belief that socialists have always had, that they could use power to dismantle power.
Right.
Now, the Marxist goal was not actually, I mean, Marx's goal here, and I even can't speak for Engels, are what Marx actually did in his life, because you and I have talked privately about how that's more inconsistent than people like to deal with. But the reason why Marxist, you know, like long phase system was the way it was is he just kind of thought you had to fundamentally alter the economics to thus alter the material conditions for other things to be possible.
Right.
That concession over time, and Kautsky gets, you know, Kautsky tries to do this hybrid, not so much to keep the Lassalleans in. They actually were the dominant tradition in the SPD. In the Social Democratic Party in Germany at the time. It was more that to move them away from nationalism and towards socialism. And Kautsky himself had been a big proponent of nationalization. After Engels sent him a chastising letter on the Offutt program, he started focusing on socialization. When Social Democrats hear this, they take it as Engels endorsing the program, which he did. But he wrote reams of critique of that program, like way more than even Marx did of the Gotha program, frankly.
Right.
And a lot of them in private letters to Kautsky, and Kautsky revised the program through his official interpretations. And because of the break with Lenin and the way Lenin has been viewed since then, we forget that Kautsky was more read than Marx as the preeminent thinker of socialism for 30 years, and it was the most crucial 30 years leading up to the revolutions and the early 20th century. That impact, I don't think that Kautsky was a Lassallean, but like that snuck back in, and it snuck back in. You know, there's a tendency to talk about like the socialist right as the Social Democrats, and the socialist center is like a range of things from Trotskyists to Stalinists who are on the right end of it to whatever. And then there's the socialist left who are the, you know, almost anarchist people, you know, the left comms and the anarcho-communist, and, you know, but the thing is that spectrum that we used to talk about, the left, I've been doing a slow dive through it recently and through the various internationals, that breaks down immediately if you look at what people actually do. The coalitions are always fragile. They don't ever line up the way they should. And there's a parallel set of opportunistic thinking in all the sides, but the left comms, and the reason why you don't see it in the left comms, frankly, the left opposition, which aren't the same thing, totally fuck up so bad that like they just get liquidated. But also they would have, like, for example, their policies, if adopted, would have starved Russia to death. Like, right? And what Stalin actually did in the 30s that really made the famines, for example, that was actually him shifting from an NEP policy to a left opposition policy without acknowledging it. So those things are there, but then the left comms have had the benefit of never ever having achieved enough to like have to compromise anywhere. They either, when they've had a chance for power, like they did in Germany and the German communist parties after Rosa Luxemburg died, they got played by the Soviets in ways that just split the parties up more. Or they just never, ever they never achieved anything. Like, you know, and in so much, unfortunately, their main lineage is getting weirder and weirder and coming up with, like, you know, going from Bordigism to Kamet primitivism and stuff. Like, it's just, like, they get more and more extreme.
Right.
They just start viewing revolution as so massive that it's impossible.
Yeah. Yeah. I've got, just recently I think this year, PM Press put out From Crisis to Communization by Gilles Dove.
Yeah.
And I've been reading through it, the beginning of it, and I'm planning on maybe starting a little series with my son where we read it together, because I gave it to him for his 23rd birthday. But what I'm noticing is that at the beginning of the book, when he's going over the outline of all the ways in which the left has sort of gone off track and all the different difficulties within the political movements of the left, and it's not very deep, but it's there. It's pretty compelling, and I tend to agree with what he's saying. And then when he starts to talk about communization theory itself, I begin to it just starts to seem confused. I mean, I'm not even following it or tracking it well enough probably at the moment to disagree, but it just doesn't seem clear to me just what how he's going to avoid localism or how he's going to avoid primitivist turn.
I don't think they really want to. I mean, one of the critiques of communization theory is that it's Pol Pot adjacent. And while that's unfair, kind of, they do kind of just basically hope massive ecological collapse makes us all communist, or riots make us all communist, because they don't believe that the workers' movement is possible anymore, and that you can never get the workers' movement to abolish its own identity. And that doesn't come up in that communization. I haven't read the book you're talking about, but I have read, and we've even done discussions on essays from it, his Eclipse and Reemergence of the Communist Movement book, from which he's been writing and rewriting since the 80s.
Yeah.
And that comes to similar conclusions, as does his work in Notes 1, which is kind of a debate around this, where I favor him over the other people. But at the same token, I moved away from all that because I was like, to me, that stuff is dangerously close to eschatology. Because it's not just that, like, you are demystifying the revolutionary subject, you are getting rid of the revolutionary subject. And now communism is something that you prepare for the moment where everything collapses and you can just seize power. But you can't collapse everything. You can't seize it. You can't dismantle it. You just have to hope it dismantles itself. I'm sure there's versions of communization that don't play out that way, but, like, a lot of them really do. So...
Right. Well, I want to go through this carefully and see where the problem with a big overview critique like that is, even if it's accurate, for me, I don't understand why they arrived where they arrive. Like, I want to understand what the problems are as they go along, to see where the wrong turns are, not because I feel like the problems are in the world, and we're going to keep running into them. The problems aren't just in our theories, right?
Right.
The problem is in the world, and we're going to keep running into them. And seeing how other people on the left went wrong might be helpful.
I've been lately reading that stuff, and then this, Mike McNair, Marxist Center, and Hal Draper, Marxist Center, which are different, actually completely different, unrelated traditions, and shouldn't be conflated together, honestly. Histories and responses, right? And one of the things I noticed is the communization theorists are hard to figure out because they use hyper-reified categories, and they're kind of slippery with them. As soon as you, like, accuse them of primitivism, they're like, oh, no, but we don't mean that. We mean real subsumption. Well, what do you mean by real subsumption? Stuff. And like I know what real subsumption means in the context it's used in capital, but I don't know, like it's been used as a category, inflation, or they'll do that thing that like Deleuze actually did and take the MCM circuit and apply it to things that aren't commodities, like movements of history, which and stuff like that. There's a book called Riot, Strike, Riot that does this, and that I think that's also like fundamentally like it's kind of, it's literally a hypostatization error. Like it is misapplying a metaphor and then coming up with a theory of history around it. Mm-hmm. Conversely, when I read a lot of the like Marxist centrist types, what I'm amazed at is they'll do this history of like the internationals and the Soviets and why they failed and all this, and they read it totally, absolutely as political decisions. Like they don't tend to deal with the fact that there was economic forces driving all of these political decisions. Like the NEP didn't come out of like Lenin's head. Right. The fact that they didn't, the Brest-Litovsk treaty went, or I'm not pronouncing that right, as listeners know, I tend to be horrible with pronunciations of anything European, but those treaties blew up. I think kind of because they literally ran out of the ability to run logistic supply chains because they didn't have enough food. To read this totally in a political way, like unfortunately McNair seems to do, at least in the book that I'm reading, and which is a book both everyone from Stalinists to social democrats love this book, Revolutionary Strategy, even though he critiques everyone. It's still largely driven by a hyper political conception of what we are, and politics is seen as a driving force.
Well, I want to go back to the social democratic turn that we just went through. Mm-hmm. And see if we can connect it to what we've been talking about here, because I think what we're talking about here is how the history of socialism or the communist movement or Marxism, let's just say the history of Marxism, has been the history of sectarian splits and different failed attempts at politics through critique, right? And that it's not always clear. It's not always easy to figure out, like with McNair, exactly what their actual politics are. And, people can start to embrace a figure in almost a fanish way because of a feeling they get or because they attacked the right people or, McNair is seen to be the critic of my enemy, therefore I'll embrace him. And everybody, since he's critiquing everyone can embrace him, maybe. Right.
Well, except for Trotskyist, right? Because he's the hardest. He's actually, even as hard as he is on like Stalinism, he's explicit about Trotskyist failures. And it's also the point where, even though this, like that book is fascinating to me coming out of studying Trotskyism for so long, where like he talks about how they miss like every single answer to the Soviet Union didn't really work. At least even if you thought some of them were true, their predictive capacity for what happens in their actual, what the parties predicted, all failed. Like nobody was right about what was going to happen, what actually happened in 1992, and no one dealt with it either.
What parties embraced the idea that the Soviet Union was state capitalist?
The one you hate the most, the ISO, the International Socialist, the Tony Cliffite tradition.
Okay, I don't hate them the most anyway.
Well, I mean, don't like them. I think they should be the one you hate the most. But like,
okay.
but what's interesting to me about them is they made the most concessions to normal left opposition, and they were also a group that historically talked out of both ends of its mouth about identity politics, for example. That the same people would like praise it.
Did they have the same reason for saying it was state capitalist?
No, they don't. Right. One of the things that we haven't talked about is like state capitalism is actually a very under-theorized theory. And like, even if you convince me of it, which I'm not sure you will, we'll have that conversation again someday. But even if you did, I don't know that most of the state capitalist theory had a robust enough understanding of either what capitalism is or what the Soviet Union ended up doing. Because one of the things that I'm really fascinated with is like state capitalists kind of stopped doing objective analysis on the Soviet Union like after the 40s. They just insisted on the point. And they may have been right. All right. I am not discounting the possibility that they're right. what I was just frustrated with going back and reading the literature with you is like nobody was actually writing about what was actually happening in like Soviet monetary policy or any of that. And when I talk about like say like Chinese state capitalism, you get into specifics way more and it's way clearer. And the only real arguments that you ever have against it is like 60% of the corporations are owned by the Communist Party, which is like the weakest ass answer to state capitalism you could possibly have.
Right. But okay, so the ISO, those are they were Trots. They were Trots, right?
Yeah, they were Trots.
Yeah, I mean the Trots had their own.
They were obviously the largest. Yeah, they did, and they were the largest form of Trots in the English-speaking world for a long time. Now, there's debate over whether the ISO or SALT, which is the other organization that had ties to different groups, were still quote-unquote Cliffites, because the other thing that happened in the 70s, the ISO, because the British SWP did this, got obsessed with Althusser and started incorporating all these post-Maoist, postmodernist Maoist fusion theories into their ideology. And you see this even in what they publish, because like if you go back long enough, it's not true anymore, but before Verso was the New Left, when Verso was New Left Press tied to the New Left Review, and they were both tied to the SWP, which has, I don't think, been the case since the 70s, or at least not past the 80s. You saw that in their selection of who they canonized and who they didn't, like within their who they were interested in. Now those decisions are largely based on academic trends and other things and individual editors there, because Verso is now a corporate press. But originally, kind of like Haymarket Books is the same way, and now it will probably become an out and out corporate press too, it was a party organ that got increasing independence over time. I bring that up only because like it muddies the waters, and the other theories are harder too. And like one of the things that I always talked about when you talked about the formed worker states, which is something that like you could theoretically, even though they hated each other, in my mind, you could believe that, and as crazy as this sounds, that the Soviet Union was both state capitalist or quasi-state capitalist, or even the non-mode of production theory by Hillel Tickton, and also believe in deformed worker statism. And like, sure, like people don't seem to get that, but you totally could. And also like the original thinkers on this, if you look at like when the Trotskyists were having the debate in the 50s, they would flip. But my only point about this is that they actually did make predictions that McNair points out about what would happen to the Soviet Union. They didn't just analyze it. They said, from these premises, X, X, and X will happen. They were all wrong. Every partisan group was wrong. And weirdly, the groups that were predictively more right were not groups that would stay Trotskyists. So, for example, the Marcyites in the UK actually had a better prediction of what was actually going to happen in the Soviet Union than everyone else. And they worked with like what would become McNair's group, which was a breakaway from a Stalinist group, actually. And this history is not immediately informative, except for the fact that in the United States, those parties are now like, you think about them as like the ultimate form of like, quote unquote, tanky, whatever, that word's being overused now, but groups that you have. So you have the WWP, the Workers' World Party, and the PSL, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, which pretty much, they literally run an education program based off the 30s, like Stalinist line officially, like that's their education program. They were Marcyite parties. They were actually the parties created by Sam Marcy from all the Trot splits. So those parties in the United States didn't even say Trotskyists.
Right.
And largely don't know their own origins. And I bring this up because it tells you how fucking weird this all got in the 90s, because that's when all this happened. Everybody was lost after the fall of the Soviet Union. And no one, I mean, like you and I the ML thing has been a little shocking to us because we would have never thought that would be a popular response. But in the same way, I mean, I hate to say it, and people are going to be really mad to me, but sometimes it does kind of remind me as a more sophisticated form of like, fuck you, dad, that you see with frog Nazis.
Oh, totally. I definitely see that. The obsession with the term boomer, There's a lot of dad insults. And as a father of four, I guess I have at least the potential to take it personally, especially as a Gen Xer. To be called a boomer is a deeply wounding insult. But in seriousness, I do think there's a bit of just trying to grab whatever is shocking.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's hard to be edgy now. Like, what are you going to do to be edgy? Like in the 90s, and I'm going to sound like you, but in the 90s, like, it's funny because a lot of those people in the transgressive culture movement, like, really regret their children in a way, because they've ended up being so crazy. But it wasn't that hard to shock. It really wasn't. Like,
yeah, I mean, Madonna put a book out with, called Sex, and where she was mostly undressed and sort of provocatively posed, and that was at least shocking enough to get headlines. But look, let's go back to the attention economy thing and see if we can start to try to tie this all together. Because
we should.
Because I feel as though, like, okay, go ahead. I feel as though, like, when you're saying that it's, people want it to be shocking, so they're embracing Marxist-Leninism, and then you point out also that the fall of the Soviet Union was truly unforeseen and also traumatic for the Marxist left, the Trot left, which was the only left that could be really could get any traction in America, or probably in the Anglophone world.
And oddly, if you talk about the non-Anglophone world, the Maoists pretty much play the same line because they're also opposed to the dominant Soviet line, even though they're Stalinist.
Right. So it was a gigantic trauma for the Marxist left, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we're still trying to recover from it in a way. But if you try to, the first difficulty we run up against is we try to work through the history of socialism and the ideas that have been generated out of the history of socialism, starting with Marx, is that there's something about the attention economy at work here, and you pointed to it being about identity formation. So there's a tendency to want to already be in the right position from the start, and to embrace ideas based on whether or not they give you the impression of being in the right position from the start, whether you immediately grok them, basically. And that seems to me tied to this click economy, this attention economy, especially when you add on the fact that it has to do with identity formation, which I hadn't really conceived of it being before. And then just throw one more thing into the mix, that when it comes to politics today, like actual electoral politics, we see it operating on the level of identity formation or blocks, right? Mm-hmm. Demographic groups. And when we start to judge candidates, we judge them based on the size, power, and moral character of those blocks. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, Elizabeth Warren won't get the nomination, or she won't be elected because her block of people, the demographic group that tends to support her, the people she appeals to, are too white, too suburban, too old, too college educated. Right? That's the line you might hear. Of course, it's the same things were leveled at Bernie Sanders in 2016. Mm-hmm. And it's as if these candidates are also just sort of prefabricated and slotted in to positions to appeal to already existing demographic groups. But we're never asking what it is but these groups are being formed around.
Right. Well, I mean, also, for example, college-educated white, even though they're not the wave of the future, they are still the largest voting bloc that actually votes. And like, that's not dealt with. And the other thing that's never dealt with is that there's this Democratic pundits tend to do this because they have they don't really seem to view these demographic aggregates as having any agency, which is nutty. They should know that from Canadian political history, for example. Like, the allegiance of, say, the Asian Canadian community shifts. It shifted from Harper to Trudeau.
Right.
Because Harper got too explicit. And that led to Trudeau's victory. And these things are like, these allegiances are precarious. In America, we tend to, because we're so defined by whiteness in some ways, we tend to actually view like everybody else as United Colors of Benetton, which is nutty and ahistorical and a sledgehammer that's just not true. We've already seen that Trump, despite all his rhetoric, got a larger, admittedly very small, but a larger portion of the vote of color than Republicans who were less hostile have gotten.
Right.
And people read that as some kind of endorsement of the position or whatever. But like, all that says to me is like, well, you actually are beginning to have a working, like a middle class, an upper middle class of color.
Yeah, it's that. And also he can play by doing the immigration politics so heavily, along with, some dog whistles on about African Americans, say, or being really strongly supportive of police and police brutality even. He can have every conservative element within the different people of color coalition kind of at least secretly back him a bit. Like, you could have African American people who said he's gonna stop those immigrants from taking our jobs. And there's a real contingency within the African American community, not just conservatives, but just across the board, who feel as though when immigrants take the jobs that were traditionally going to Black Americans, that it's a symptom not only of betrayal by the state or something, but because of these open border policies, but really that it's a symptom also of the deep, long history of racism against them. Mm-hmm. That even these foreigners are more humanized than they are. So you can use these racial problems every which way. And actually the fact that, the Southern strategy for the Republicans is still relatively new. I mean, it's not brand new by any means, but that represented a massive change in where the allegiances were in the country.
Yeah, as a Southerner, I actually, as a Southerner, since everybody announces their identity before everything now, I am deeply suspicious of the South. But I also want to say that I don't think people get that, how recent that was. In Georgia, where I grew up, we had our first ever post-Reconstruction Republican governor in the year 2000. It was after the Clinton years when that finally happened. Now, it wasn't like Georgia was a liberal bastion before then. Libertarianism seemed more edgy to me because conservatives really weren't libertarians in my area. They were communitarian Christians, and they were usually actually white Democrats who were in kind of a détente with Black Democrats. And then by the 2000s, what happened with the parties is the white Democrats just changed their party from D to R. Literally. Right. That's like they didn't. There wasn't even like a wave of Republican elections. The Democrats just all finally finished moving to the Republican Party. But what was also missed at the time, although it's been talked about now in the end of the Obama years, is how like a lot of the Black Congressional Caucus in Georgia made deals with the devil to keep their districts Black and thus keep their representation by diluting liberal and progressive vote. Because if they thought, if we have more white liberals in this thing, they will vote in white liberal jurors. I mean, like not jurors, senators and more importantly, Congress people and state representatives and state senators. And so there was a detente made there, just like the Dixiecrat Black Democrat detente that had kind of been existing all the way back to the New Deal. And I mean, one of the things that people don't know, and I got this out of studying, the Comintern's movement in the United States. I want to actually say during the third period part of the Comintern, like the Stalinists were doing God's work on anti-racism in the South, and they immediately pivoted towards the Dixiecrats in the Popular Front period. Immediately. Part of it was, for the war, but like they erased all that history themselves. Now everyone picks it up now and talks about racial progressiveness of Marxist Leninism, but they also ignore the fact that they actively, during the Roosevelt administration, actively suppressed the very movements they built to maintain a coalition with Democrats, and the Democrats had to maintain a coalition with Dixiecrats, which did not end until I was an adult. So,
right.
Like this, like the thing is right now, and I'm gonna I will now sound like a craggy Gen Xer. Millennials really don't know because, and I don't think this is a generational flaw. I think that's actually a result of technology. They have access to all this information in ways that we never did, but it doesn't seem important. So like they don't know most of this stuff. They don't. I mean, I feel like when I talk to people, they don't even know how bad things really were under the Bush administration, because the people talk about the Trump administration as if we're in a bigger existential crisis, and with except for maybe climate, we are not.
Thank you for listening to Pop to the Left. We'd like to thank our producer, Toby Keemer, and everyone at Zero Books for supporting the podcast. Please contribute to the Zero Books Patreon to keep us going and to hear additional episodes.
Rest